The United States government has consistently employed various tactics including surveillance, censorship, and the criminalization of dissent to suppress free speech and assembly during times of perceived national threat, which infringe the rights offered by the First Amendment, as evidenced by the responses to World War I, World War II, the Cold War, and the 9/11 attacks. In fact, the Espionage and Sedition Acts played a major role. The Espionage Act of 1917 is a United States federal law enacted on June 15, 1917, shortly after the United States entered World War I. It has been amended numerous times over the years. It was originally found in Title 50 of the U.S. Code War and National Defense, but is now found under Title 18 Crime and Criminal Procedure. It was intended to prohibit interference with military operations or recruitment, to prevent insubordination in the military, and to prevent the support of enemies of the United States during wartime. In 1919, the Supreme Court case of the United States unanimously ruled through Schneck v. United States that the act did not violate the freedom of speech of those convicted under its provisions. The constitutionality of the law, its relationship to free speech, and the meaning of its language have been contested in court ever since. Espionage Act of 1917. Section 3. Whoever, when the United States is at war, shall willfully make or convey false reports or false statements with intent to interfere with the operation or success of the military or naval forces of the United States, or to promote the success of its enemies, and whoever, when the United States is at war, shall willfully cause or attempt to cause insubordination, disloyalty, mutiny, refusal of duty in the military or naval forces of the United States, or shall willfully obstruct the recruiting or enlistment service of the United States, to the injury of the service or of the United States, shall be punished by a fine of not more than $10,000 or imprisonment for not more than 20 years, or both. World War I era. The Espionage Act was initially passed in 1917 to combat espionage and sabotage during World War I. However, it was also used to prosecute individuals who criticized the war effort or the government, leading to the imprisonment of many socialists, anarchists, and pacifists. Cold War era. During the Cold War, the Espionage Act was used to target individuals suspected of communist sympathies or accused of leaking classified information. This led to the persecution of many individuals, including some who were later exonerated. Post 9/11 era. In the aftermath of the September 11th attacks, the Espionage Act has been used to prosecute individuals accused of leaking classified information to the press, raising concerns about the impact on investigative journalism and government transparency. One example of a case where the defendants were accused of espionage were the Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were executed in 1953 for allegedly passing atomic secrets to the Soviet Union. However, their conviction had been widely questioned, and many believed they were innocent victims of Cold War hysteria. Julius, an engineer, and Ethel, a secretary, were arrested in 1950 and implicated by Ethel's brother, David Greenglass. Despite their protest of innocence, they were convicted and sentenced to death. Their case sparked international debate, with some arguing they were victims of injustice and others supporting their conviction. President Eisenhower declined to grant clemency, stating that their actions could have led to the death of millions. Alva Johnson. In the 1950s, Johnson was accused of being a Soviet spy and imprisoned for several years. He was eventually released and exonerated. David Greenglass. Greenglass was a key witness in the Rosenberg trial, but later recanted his testimony, admitted, and lied under pressure from the government. The Rosenberg spy case was a highly controversial event during the Cold War. Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were convicted of espionage for passing atomic secrets to the Soviet Union. Key points of the case include Cold War context. The trial took place during heightened anti-communist sentiment. Key witness. Ethel's brother, David Greenglass, was a primary witness against the couple. Controversial testimony. Greenglass later recanted parts of his testimony, raising doubts about the conviction. Harsh sentence. Both Rosenbergs were sentenced to death, and Ethel was executed in 1953. And during debate, the case continues to be debated, with many questioning the fairness of the trial and the severity of the punishment. The case also raised concerns about the First Amendment violations. Some argued that the Rosenbergs were denied a fair trial and that their convictions were based on circumstantial evidence and McCarthyism. Others argued that the government had a right to protect national security and that the Rosenbergs were guilty of treason. The Rosenberg case continues to be a subject of debate and controversy. Some historians argue that the Rosenbergs were innocent and that they were executed because of their political beliefs. Others argue that they were guilty and that their execution was justified. Here are some implications of First Amendment violations in the case. The Rosenbergs were denied a fair trial. Their conviction was based on circumstantial evidence and McCarthyism. The government had a right to protect national security. The Rosenbergs were guilty of treason. The case also raises questions about the balance between national security and individual rights. The Rosenbergs were executed during the Cold War, a time when the United States was very concerned about the threat of communism. In the aftermath of the case, there was a debate about whether the government had gone too far in its efforts to protect national security. The Rosenberg case is a complex and controversial case that continues to be debated today. It is a reminder of the importance of the First Amendment and the need to protect individual rights even in the times of national crisis. The First Amendment guarantees freedom of speech, press, religion, assembly, and petition. It doesn't directly address the right to a fair trial. That right is primarily protected by the Sixth Amendment, which guarantees the right to a speedy and public trial by an impartial jury. However, the First Amendment can still have indirect implications for a fair trial. For example, if a defendant's right to a fair trial is prejudiced by excessive pretrial publicity, it could raise First Amendment concerns about the balance between free speech and the right to do a fair trial. In the case of the Rosenbergs, while the First Amendment wasn't directly violated, the intense media scrutiny and public sentiment surrounding the trial could have indirectly impacted their ability to receive a fair trial. This is a complex issue with ongoing legal and ethical debates. These laws led to the prosecution of many individuals, including socialists, pacifists, and anti-war activists. Some notable cases include Schneck v. United States 1919. Eugene V. Debs, a socialist leader, was imprisoned for 10 years for delivering an anti-war speech. Abrams v. United States 1919. Several Russian immigrants were convicted for distributing anti-war leaflets. These cases highlight how the government used these laws to suppress dissent and limit freedom of speech during wartime. During World War II, the U.S. government also took actions that infringed upon First Amendment rights, particularly for individuals perceived as threats to national security. Number 1. Censorship and surveillance. The U.S. government also implemented censorship and surveillance measures to monitor and control information during the war. The Office of Censorship, established in 1941, had the power to censor mail, telegrams, and radio broadcasts. Additionally, the FBI conducted surveillance on individuals suspected of disloyalty or subversive activities, including those with left-wing political views. Number 2. Smith Act. The Smith Act of 1940 passed before the United States entered World War II, criminalizing advocating for the overthrow of the government by force or violence. This law was used to prosecute members of the Communist Party and other left-wing organizations, further restricting freedom of speech and association. These examples demonstrate how the government's response to World War II led to the significant infringement on First Amendment rights, particularly for those perceived as a threat to national security. The Cold War era saw a significant erosion of First Amendment rights in the United States, fueled by the Red Scare and the fear of communist infiltration. Here are some key examples. McCarthyism in congressional investigations. House Un-American Activities Committee, or the HUAC, conducted investigations into alleged communist activities in the United States, often targeting Hollywood figures, academics, and government employees. These hearings often relied on accusations and innuendo, damaging reputation and careers. The McCarthy hearings. Senator Joseph McCarthy led a series of high-profile hearings that accused government officials of being communist sympathizers. These hearings often relied on guilt by association and created a climate of fear and suspicion. Surveillance and espionage. FBI surveillance. The FBI conducted extensive surveillance on individuals suspected of communist sympathies or affiliations, including monitoring their phone calls, mail, and personal relationships. COINTELPRO. The FBI's counterintelligence program, or the COINTELPRO, targeted various social and political groups, including the Black Panther Party and the American Indian Movement, using tactics like infiltration, disinformation, and harassment. Blacklisting and censorship. Hollywood blacklist. The Hollywood blacklist was a practice of denying employment to individuals suspected of communist sympathies. This blacklist severely limited the careers of many talented writers, directors, and actors. Censorship of books and films. Books and films that were deemed to be communist propaganda or subversive were often banned or censored. Restrictions on labor unions. Taft-Hartley Act. This act imposed restrictions on labor unions, including provisions that limited the ability of unions to engage in political activities. This had a chilling effect on labor organizations and activism. These examples demonstrate how the Cold War climate led to a significant curtailment of First Amendment rights, as the government prioritized national security over individual liberties. The aftermath of the 9/11 attacks led to significant changes in the U.S. security policies, some of which raised concerns about potential infringements on First Amendment rights. Number 1. The USA Patriot Act. Expanded surveillance powers. This act significantly expanded the government's surveillance powers, allowing for warrantless searches of homes and businesses, access to library and medical records, and monitoring of internet activity. Detention of non-citizens. This act allowed for the indefinite detention of non-citizens suspected of terrorism, raising concerns about due process and fair treatment. Number 2. Increased scrutiny of Muslim Americans. Profiling and discrimination. Muslim Americans face increased scrutiny and discrimination, leading to profiling at airports and other public places. Restrictions on religious practices. Some Muslim Americans reported difficulties in practicing their religion, including restrictions on building mosques and organizing religious events. Number 3. Restrictions on freedom of speech. Censorship and self-censorship. Fear of the government surveillance and potential repercussions led to self-censorship and a chilling effect on free speech, particularly for those who criticize government policies. Even now, in the present era, the government has violated our First Amendment by the recent banning of TikTok. The justification for this was to defend national security. But there's one thing from the documentary that you should take. All of the First Amendment right infringements shown here were for the sake of defending national security. Whether it be ethical or not, the government still decided to employ them. In conclusion, this is evidence showing how the government violated our freedom of speech during times of war or national threat.